Today is Saturday, October 13th, 2018, and we are at the Community Media Center in Westminster, Maryland. I am Bill Palm, and I'm interviewing George Burke today, and he is from, well, what's your hometown?
I currently live in New Windsor, Maryland.
Okay.
I was born in New York, went to grade school in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and pretty much a nomad after that until 17 years ago when I moved to New Windsor.
Okay, but 20 years in the Army.
20 years in the Army. Yes.
Okay, that will get you all, that'll get you a tour of the world.
Well, beyond that, it introduced me to our international neighbors, and I found that I was getting a lot of soothing to my intellectual curiosity. So I did a lot of traveling outside Army business. And I've been to 38 different countries and lived in 4, and 6 states in the United States. God only knows how many cities. So yeah, I'd like to think I'm well traveled.
Very good, very good. Let's start at the beginning. How did you end up in the Army in the first place?
Well, I tried to join the Air Force right out of high school when I was 17, and wanted to fly, and scored very high in all of the academic-related portions of the enlistment process. But when I was actually called to duty, they found that I had unacceptable depth perception in my left eye, so I couldn't fly. And that gave me a deferment at the time. So what that meant was, as a 17-year-old, that I could get a job. I was employable because employers didn't have to worry about me being drafted. The irony of that is when I was 23, the Army did draft me and waived the sight requirement, but I still couldn't fly. They needed people in the infantry, and they couldn't get the Clintons and the Trumps of the world, so they picked on me, and those like me.
Yeah, hardly a unique story, but yes, understood. And you went to basic where?
Went to basic at Fort Benning, Georgia.
Infantry school?
Yep.
And you stayed there for AIT?
Went to basic at Fort Benning, advanced individual training at Fort Dix, and then that's where I stayed for utilization for about 1.5 years. And then I went back to Fort Benning for officer candidate school, infantry, and then ended up there for about 1 year of utilization as a ranger instructor. And then I went to Vietnam, was there for all practical purposes 1 year, came back to Fort Benning for about 4.5 years of utilization, teaching parachuting and going to advanced infantry training there at Fort Benning.
Okay, well let's talk a little bit more about your experience in Vietnam. You were serving with whom?
Military Advisory Command, MACV, as most people know it.
And what was your assignment with MACV?
Well, I had 2 assignments. One was as a infantry battalion advisor for the 5th ARVN Division, which was Vietnamese. And then I was moved to the division recon team, where I was an advisor to the division recon element. And
that must have been fascinating.
Well, it was fascinating. As I mentioned earlier, my claim to fame there was doing border reconnaissance for 2 major U.S. units that went into Cambodia after having been authorized by President Nixon in coordination with the leaders in Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam.
And that must have been challenging, shall we say?
Well, it was had multiple purposes. The primary purpose was to find potential targets and identify avenues of approach for the NVA, who moved out of North Vietnam through Laos, Cambodia, and down into what's affectionately known as the Parrot's Beak, which was the shortest route into Saigon. So we were able to find what we thought were some of the supply routes that were involved in Cambodia. So there was that, and then looking for targets of opportunity like arms caches and medical caches and food supply, that kind of stuff that was pre-positioned by the NVA. And then our secondary mission was ground reconnaissance. In other words, we had to determine where heavy equipment could travel, and then where the foot soldiers could travel, which was quite different. There was a lot of marsh there at the time, so we had to record for the American leadership, combat leadership, where the ground was soft, not conducive to armored travel, and that was hard. That, of course, was more conducive to armor type travel.
So you did a lot of the preparation work then for the invasion of Cambodia.
Yeah, there were two Americans. Both of us were assigned to MACV, and then they had a highly selected team of 9 that were with the South Vietnamese unit, and they were superb soldiers, and I was very proud to be their unofficial leader, let's say, because it was during a time of Vietnamization where they were trying to turn over the war to the South Vietnamese. So the South Vietnamese member of the 9-man team was, the recognized leader of the group. But there's no way that individual could summon the resources that we eventually would need in case of contact. And when I'm talking about resources, I'm talking about American artillery and aircraft and mortar and the things that you really need in fire support role if you were to make contact with the enemy.
And you made contact with the enemy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You have that Purple Heart.
Yes.
Okay. Do you want to comment on that a bit?
Yeah, sure. Unlike some people, it was an emotional time for me, and really helped to identify who I am as a person today. You quickly gain a feel for what your abilities are, let's say. But on the last night of our recon,
The last night,
we couldn't make it back to the base camp. So we set up in a temporary perimeter just to get through the evening, and then at first light we'd plan on breaking down the temporary camp and then moving into the base. Well, where we set up the temporary camp ended up being along one of the chosen NVA routes. So our 11-man team was confronted with a NVA force of about 200, and at the initial contact, which was about 8:30 in the evening, my interpreter was killed and I was wounded, and I didn't know at the time how many others had been wounded. But being a recon team, you're pretty much out of ammunition and hand grenades and the stuff that you can carry in just a few minutes. But given the visibility and the importance of the mission, we had Air Force pre-planned in support, as well as artillery fire and mortar fire. And so the minute that we had contact, I gave a verbal signal through our communications net, and within minutes we had Air Force aircraft on station that was coordinating all the fires. So we had high-performance jets dropping bombs and napalm, and gunships that were providing aerial fire support, and then American units that were firing mortars. And my job was only to maintain communications with the Air Force and to mark our position on the ground. Well, given that it was at night, I had to use a strobe light to mark our position. And every time I flashed the strobe light, then I became an immediate target. So somewhere around 8:30 was the initial contact, and then I was hit again around 10:30, around 2:30, and around 3:30. So 4 separate times I was wounded that night while trying to lead the battle. Fortunately, there wasn't anything really life-threatening, but I was extremely concerned about loss of blood, and and emotions, adrenaline is just so high, you don't feel anything, and that's kind of how I was, and I didn't have to move around an awful lot because we were a very tight perimeter, and just in calling out to members of the team, I got very little response. And then the following day, we found that everybody on the team had been killed or wounded. So it was quite an evening for me and those who survived, and friends and relatives of those who didn't.
Could you talk a little bit more about working with the Vietnamese? You mentioned that it was an honor to serve with them. It must have been really an eye-opening experience.
Well, for many respects, the South Vietnamese didn't get a lot of respect for Americans. They thought they were unmotivated, and I think if you looked at them from a distance, it's well justified. But when you're working with them and you get to learn something about their personality, and you consider that they are not internationally intelligent people as we are, and it's not a knock against them, it's just that the only thing that really mattered to them was family and farm. They had no TV, they didn't have telephones, they didn't have any means of communicating with the outside world. And for some of them, when they're recruited or when they join the Army, it's for life, and sometimes that life is cut short through combat. So a lot of the ones that I knew just said, "Hey, we're not really in offensive mode as much as we just want to stay alive." So that helps explain when they say they didn't seem to be motivated. Well, they didn't seem to be motivated by our standard, but by their standard, they were highly motivated. And and you have to appreciate that when you're working with them. There's always because of American turnover, there's always the problem of bonding with your counterparts. And we had a situation after I had been wounded. This was several months after. We had an incident where one of our Vietnamese fire support bases was overrun, or had the potential of being overrun by NVA regulars. And they lost 2 advisors in the initial contact. So I was asked to fly out and establish communications so we could get in American fire support to thwart the battle. And once we survived the evening, it was a matter of going around the perimeter and talking the best I could with the Vietnamese through an interpreter. But what I found later on the first day after the battle, when we went to the Vietnamese version of a mess hall, they had some soldiers sitting around a table playing a form of chess. Now, I'm going to pronounce this wrong because I don't think I ever heard it correctly, but I think they called it gatung. And it uses different characters on a little cheap paper board. And I was watching, and I asked the one soldier who was contemplating a move, I made a motion that maybe he should move the one piece from where it was to another. And right away, they said, "Do you know the game? Do you know the game?" And I said, "Well, I had learned it in the States before going to Vietnam as part of our Vietnam language training." So I sat down and took a position opposite another player, and they could care less about my skill. What they were impressed with is that I knew the game. I took time to learn it. So yeah, we had a few interesting games. Of course, I got beat, but where I didn't get beat was earning the respect of all of the soldiers in the compound. And that really helps when you need to get things done. And we were able to restore order in a short period of time. The camp needed a lot of work after the NVA had tried to penetrate the border. They used a lot of things, explosives, to tear down the barriers, and we had to reconstruct all of those barriers.
So you suddenly found yourself an engineer.
Say again?
You were suddenly an engineer then.
No, not really. I mean, I knew what had to get done, and they had their own infrastructure, plus their bases. When you start talking about mainly barbed wire and foxholes and reconstructing with sandbags and stuff, you don't need a lot of engineer expertise. And we had no equipment like bulldozers and types of equipment. I think they called it PSP or something, the steel planking, the steel plating or whatever. We didn't have any of that. It was basically barbed wire, razor wire, and redigging foxholes, redigging bunkers, refilling sandbags to use in the reconstruction of the bunkers. So again, not a lot of engineering work went into that.
Yeah, I've ever working with Vietnamese and seeing indeed a difference in terms of the kinds of materials available to work with. There was an expression that if you gave a Vietnamese carpenter fresh lumber and a straight nail, he wouldn't know what to do with it. I don't know if you saw that, but.
Oh yeah, well, if you take them out into the forest and cut down a bunch of trees, you'd have a hooch in 20 minutes.
Yeah.
A hooch being a place to live, a little house, a little makeshift house. Yeah, they could do all that in a hurry.
And I certainly knew Vietnamese who had a tremendously acute understanding of English, understood the nuance of various words and so forth. And I could not master a tonal language to save my soul.
Yeah.
The language was just really, really, beyond me.
Well, it's a guttural language, and if you can't pick up on the guttural aspects of the words, then it's very difficult to communicate. But on the humorous side, it's the number of English words that had been infused into their language because there wasn't any direct interpretation. So you'll have a Vietnamese speaking Vietnamese, and in the middle of a sentence he'd say turbocharger or helicopter or something that didn't have a Vietnamese translation. And as serious as the overall situation was, that provided a lot of humor in listening to them talk.
You also got some strange translations of, our attempts to speak Vietnamese, like Co Van Mi. I don't know if you
don't know the term.
Okay, advisor, or American advisor, which also translated to, depending on how you pronounced it, American footbridge. But some humor there as well. So after you got back, what did you end up doing?
Well, when I returned from Vietnam, I had a lot of friends at Fort Benning from my days of officer candidate training and for my year as a ranger instructor. And some of those friends had moved to the parachute training unit, which was called the Airborne Department at Fort Benning. So I went into the Airborne Department really looking for a job once I got to Fort Benning. And some of those people were there and they hired me. So for 2 years, I was a company commander, and then for 1 year, I was the operations officer for the Airborne Department. And then after that term, I went to the Infantry Officers Advanced Course at Fort Benning. And then given my performance to date and the fact that I didn't have a degree, I applied for degree completion after the advanced infantry training, and I was sent all expenses paid to college to complete my undergraduate degree.
Oh, where did you go for that?
University of Tampa in Florida.
Very good, very good. So near family?
Family was with me. I was married at the time, and both of my children were born while I was stationed at Fort Benning, and they were 16 months apart. And we did some traveling right away. My son was 5 weeks old when we moved from Fort Benning to St. Petersburg, Florida, so I could go to school at the University of Tampa. And then my daughter was just 16 months older, and then we were down at school there for about a year, and we all ended up going to Korea. And Korea was interesting because it was an unaccompanied tour, which means I had to go by myself. But given my childhood, which was less than desirable, let's say, I didn't want my kids forgetting who their father was. So between their mother and I, we funded so that everybody could go. And my wife and 2 kids moved to Seoul, Korea, and I was about 35 miles north and just south of the North and South Korean border. But the good news is the American system of communication was well established in South Vietnam or
South Korea. Yeah.
And I had telephone communication, a military landline to my apartment in Seoul, Korea. So I could talk to my kids pretty much every night. And then I got to see them about every other Saturday night. So that was a big advantage. And then, of course, I had 11 days of vacation while I was there. And we all went to Japan and toured Japan. Toured Japan for 11 days. So that assignment had a lot of benefit also.
And then you decided eventually that you wanted to be a civilian again, and
Well, it's interesting you asked that question, because the next assignment for me was Charlotte, North Carolina. I spent 4 years in the Army's recruiting command and got involved in a lot of civil projects. Part of that was, representing the Army and doing good things for the community, and it also gave me an opportunity to know that I really wanted to return to the civilian community. So after that assignment, I went to Kansas to the Army's Command and General Staff College for 1 year, and then I went to Germany for 4 years, and that pretty much set me up for retirement.
very good. Okay, well, it's been absolutely a pleasure talking to you today.
My pleasure.